The Middle East erupted once more in a conflagration of violence, a region already fraught with tension and historical grievances. This latest surge in hostilities marks a grim one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks, a day etched in the memories of many. On October 6, 2024, Israel launched airstrikes against targets in Beirut, Lebanon, a city that has seen its share of turmoil and destruction over the years. This retaliation came after a barrage of rockets fired from Hezbollah positions struck Israeli territory, causing significant damage and loss of life. This exchange marked a dangerous escalation in a conflict that has simmered for decades, with each side unwilling to back down. The primary actors in this volatile theater are Israel, determined to defend its borders and citizens with every means at its disposal, and Iran, the looming power behind Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, both of which have been instrumental in the ongoing conflict. These Iranian proxies have long been thorns in Israel's side, launching attacks and fueling instability, making peace a distant dream. The events of early October 2024 plunged the region back into a cycle of violence, raising fears of a wider conflict that could engulf neighboring countries. The shadow of the 2023 war, which saw Israel engage in a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza, hung heavy over the region, a stark reminder of the devastation that can unfold. The world watched with bated breath, hoping for restraint but bracing for further escalation. International leaders called for calm, yet the drums of war seemed to beat louder with each passing day. Amidst the chaos, there were still glimmers of hope as diplomats and peacekeepers worked tirelessly behind the scenes, striving to broker a ceasefire and bring an end to the bloodshed. Humanitarian efforts ramped up, with aid organizations delivering much-needed supplies to those caught in the crossfire, highlighting the resilience and compassion of the human spirit even in the darkest times. Around the globe, people took to the streets, demanding an end to the violence and calling for peace, their voices a powerful reminder that the world yearns for an end to this seemingly endless conflict. Israel responded to the Hezbollah rocket attacks with overwhelming force. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, targeted what they claimed were Hezbollah infrastructure and weapons depots in Lebanon. The strikes on Beirut, a city already scarred by conflict, caused significant damage. Simultaneously, Israel continued its ongoing operations against Hamas in Gaza. The Gaza Strip, densely populated and impoverished, once again became a battleground. The IDF carried out airstrikes targeting Hamas positions and facilities. Israel justified its actions as self-defense, a necessary response to protect its citizens from terrorism. The government vowed to continue its operations until the rocket fire ceased and the threat to its security was neutralized. The recent escalation in violence underscored the complexity of the Middle East conflict. Israel now faces threats on multiple fronts, fueled by Iran's ambition to expand its influence and undermine Israeli security. Hezbollah, armed and funded by Iran, has transformed into a formidable force in Lebanon. Its arsenal of rockets and missiles poses a direct threat to Israeli cities and infrastructure. Hamas, controlling the Gaza Strip, remains a persistent adversary, launching rockets and carrying out attacks. This multi-front challenge stretches Israel's military capabilities and forces it to make difficult strategic choices. The interconnected nature of these conflicts raises the specter of a regional war, a nightmare scenario with the potential to draw in other regional and global powers. The international community reacted to the renewed violence with a mixture of condemnation and calls for restraint. However, the response was far from unified, reflecting the deep divisions over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The United States, Israel's staunch ally, reiterated its unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself. However, there were also calls from Washington for all sides to de-escalate the situation and avoid civilian casualties. European nations, while condemning the violence, expressed growing frustration with the lack of progress toward a peaceful resolution. Some European leaders criticized Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, arguing that they fueled resentment and hindered lasting peace. As the dust settled from the initial exchanges, the true cost of the conflict began to emerge. The fighting in Lebanon and Gaza resulted in significant damage to infrastructure and, tragically, loss of life. In Beirut, Israeli airstrikes caused widespread damage to buildings, roads, and critical infrastructure. Hospitals struggled to cope with the influx of casualties. The Lebanese Red Cross reported hundreds of deaths and thousands injured, many of them civilians caught in the crossfire. The Gaza Strip, already suffering from a dire humanitarian situation, faced further devastation. The IDF's airstrikes targeted Hamas facilities, but the dense urban environment meant that civilian areas were inevitably affected. Hospitals, already struggling with shortages, were overwhelmed with the wounded. The escalating conflict presented Western governments with a familiar dilemma: how to reconcile their support for Israel with the need to prevent a wider regional conflagration. This balancing act required careful consideration of both immediate and long-term consequences, as any misstep could lead to further instability in an already volatile region. The United States, in particular, found itself walking a tightrope. The Biden administration had to navigate a complex web of domestic and international pressures, each pulling in different directions. The Biden administration faced pressure from within the US to stand firmly with Israel, its closest ally in the region. This pressure came from various quarters, including influential political lobbies, public opinion, and strategic military alliances. However, there was also recognition that uncritical support for Israel's actions risked exacerbating the situation and undermining long-term US interests in the region. Critics argued that a more balanced approach was necessary to maintain credibility and foster peace. European nations, with their own historical and political sensitivities, urged both sides to show restraint. They emphasized the importance of dialogue and diplomacy, advocating for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. There were calls for a ceasefire and a return to negotiations. International bodies and global leaders stressed the urgency of de-escalation and the need for a sustainable peace process. However, the lack of trust between the parties and the deep-seated nature of the conflict made a negotiated settlement seem like a distant prospect. The historical grievances and ongoing hostilities created significant barriers to achieving lasting peace, leaving the international community grappling with how to effectively mediate and support a resolution. Iran's role in the escalating conflict was a subject of intense scrutiny and condemnation. Israel accused Iran of orchestrating the attacks by Hezbollah and Hamas, aiming to destabilize the region and weaken Israel. Iran, while denying direct involvement, made no secret of its support for these groups. Tehran views Israel as an illegitimate state and a threat to its regional ambitions. By providing financial and military aid to Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran seeks to keep pressure on Israel and undermine its security. This strategy carries significant risks for Iran. By fueling the flames of conflict, Iran risks provoking a wider war that could engulf the entire region. Furthermore, Iran's actions further isolate it from the international community and reinforce its image as a rogue state. As the fighting raged on, the path ahead remained treacherous and uncertain. The streets echoed with the sounds of conflict, and the air was thick with tension and fear. Every corner seemed to hold a new danger, and the future was shrouded in a haze of unpredictability. The latest round of violence had only deepened the divisions between the parties, making a negotiated settlement seem more elusive than ever. The scars of war were etched into the very fabric of the communities, and the hope for peace seemed to fade with each passing day. The chasm between the warring factions grew wider, fueled by mistrust and animosity. The international community, though divided, recognized the urgent need for a ceasefire and a return to dialogue. Diplomatic efforts were ramped up, with world leaders calling for an end to hostilities and a renewed commitment to peace. The halls of the United Nations buzzed with activity as delegates worked tirelessly to broker a truce. However, the lack of trust between the parties and the absence of a viable peace process made progress difficult. Each failed negotiation only served to deepen the distrust, and the prospect of a lasting peace seemed to slip further out of reach. The road to reconciliation was fraught with obstacles, and the journey ahead appeared daunting. Meanwhile, the people of Lebanon and Gaza bore the brunt of the conflict. Families were torn apart and communities were left in ruins. The innocent civilians caught in the crossfire faced unimaginable hardships. Their lives were upended and their futures were uncertain. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, already dire, deteriorated rapidly. The basic necessities of life became scarce and the struggle for survival intensified. The streets of Gaza were filled with the rubble of destroyed homes and the refugee camps swelled with those seeking shelter. Hospitals struggled to cope with the influx of casualties and essential supplies dwindled. Medical staff worked around the clock, often in makeshift facilities, to provide care to the injured. The healthcare system was stretched to its limits and the need for international aid became more pressing. The international community had a moral obligation to provide humanitarian assistance to those in need and to work towards a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Aid shipments began to arrive, and volunteers on the ground worked tirelessly to distribute supplies. Global protests called for an end to the violence and a commitment to peace. Failure to do so risked further suffering and instability, not only in the Middle East but also beyond. The ripple effects of the conflict were felt around the world, and the need for a comprehensive and lasting solution was more urgent than ever. The path to peace was long and arduous, but it was a journey that the international community could not afford to abandon.